January 12th, 1888. The temperature plunged 60 degrees in just 3 minutes. Across Nebraska, children walked home from school into a wall of white death, snow so thick you couldn't see your own hand. By morning, over 100 Nebraskans lay frozen, most of them children who died within yards of their own doors. A 14-year-old boy froze clutching a fence post, a quarter-mile from his own home. But in one barn, beneath the frozen prairie ground, Martha Lindqvist and her 3 children woke to warmth. The thermometer read 38 degrees. While families burned their furniture and watched their children die, this Swedish widow had built something her neighbors called madness, and it saved every life she loved. The trap door pushed open against 3 feet of packed snow. Martha Lindqvist climbed into a world that had died overnight, 40 degrees below zero. The air burned her throat with the first breath. Ice formed on her eyelashes within seconds. She could feel the tiny crystals hardening, welding her eyes half shut. She pulled herself up through the opening and stood in the barn, or what remained of it. The horse was still standing, frozen solid. Its legs locked beneath it, its head drooped, its eyes open and glazed with frost. It had died on its feet, too cold to fall. Behind her, 3 children climbed up from the warmth below. Anna, 12. Johann, 8. Little Eric, 5. Their faces were flushed pink from the underground room where the thermometer had read 38 degrees through the night. They had slept under quilts while the temperature outside plunged past 40 below. Martha pushed open the barn door. The hinges screamed against the ice, and then she saw. The prairie stretched white and still in every direction. No cattle lowing, no chickens scratching, no smoke rising from the neighboring chimneys, not the Hoffman's place 3/4 of a mile east, not the miller's 2 miles north. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that follows death. She walked toward the Hoffman fence line. 50 yards from her barn, she found him. Old Wilhelm Hoffman, not August, the father, but young Wilhelm, the 14-year-old son, lay curled against a fence post. His hands were frozen to the wood, still gripping it. He had died reaching for something to guide him home. The schoolhouse was 4 miles away. He had made it to within a quarter-mile of his own door. While the schoolhouse blizzard killed over 100 Nebraskans, most of them children caught walking home from school, Martha's family had survived in the underground room the neighbors called that widow's folly. But 6 months earlier, when Martha Lindqvist first drove her spade into the frozen ground behind the barn, the only thing her neighbors saw was a woman losing her mind. September 1887, Custer County, Nebraska. Martha stood in the doorway of her sod house and counted what she had left. 2 milk cows, both thin from the summer drought, 6 chickens that had stopped laying in the heat, 1 draft horse, the other had died in August when the creek went dry, and 3 children watching her with eyes that asked questions she could not answer. The soddy measured 14 feet by 16 feet, walls 2 feet thick, cut from the prairie itself, stacked like bricks and plastered with mud. The roof was lumber and sod, and it had begun to sag after 2 Nebraska winters. When it rained, mud dripped onto the table. When the wind blew, dust sifted through cracks she could not find. Eric had built this house. Eric had cut every sod brick, hauled every timber, hung the single door that never closed right. Eric had promised her they would prove the claim together, build something real, give their children land of their own. Eric had died of typhoid 13 months ago, leaving her with 14 months remaining on the 5-year residency requirement and $11.40 in the tin box beneath the floorboards. Martha walked to the woodpile behind the soddy. There was no woodpile. There was a stack of twisted hay, prairie grass wound into tight cylinders that burned hot and fast and required constant feeding. She counted the cylinders. Enough for perhaps 2 weeks if she burned nothing at night. The nearest timber was 15 miles away. The nearest town, Broken Bow, was 16 miles. The nearest neighbor was August Hoffman, 3/4 of a mile east, and August Hoffman had made his position clear. He arrived that afternoon on horseback, his shadow falling across her doorway like a threat. Hoffman was 52 years old and had homesteaded this stretch of Lillian Creek for 11 years. He had survived the winter of 1880 to 81, the snow winter, they called it, when drifts buried houses and families burned furniture, and then floorboards and then froze anyway. He had buried 3 families that first winter. He knew what the prairie could do. He dismounted and stood with his hands on his belt, studying her soddy. The way a man studies a horse he is deciding whether to shoot. "Mrs. Lindqvist," he said, "I'll speak plain because winter won't wait for politeness. You have no fuel. You have no money to buy coal at $8 a ton. You have no husband to cut timber or twist hay while you tend children. Your roof is sagging and your cow is dry, and the drought has killed your corn crop." Martha said nothing. The children were inside. She could feel them listening through the gap in the door. "I buried 3 families that first winter," Hoffman said. "Good men, strong men with sons to help them and wives to keep the fire. You cannot make it alone. A woman with children and no fuel has no business on this claim come January." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. "I'll give you $40 for your quarter section. That's a fair price, more than fair considering. You can take the children to Omaha, find work, start over somewhere the cold won't kill you." "And if I don't sell?" Hoffman's jaw tightened. "Then marry me. I'll move you and the children to my place. Your claim joins to mine. The land stays in the family." Martha felt her hands curl at her sides. She had known this was coming. Hoffman had been circling since the week Eric died, offering help that always came with conditions, charity that always carried a price. "If I marry you, the claim becomes yours." "That's the law." "Then I won't marry you." Hoffman shook his head slowly, the way a man does when confronted with a child who refuses to understand simple mathematics. "The prairie does not care about pride, Mrs. Lindqvist. I've seen what happens to pride out here. Pride freezes solid and doesn't thaw until spring when the coyotes find it." He folded the paper and tucked it back into his coat. "Make your decision by first snowfall, but do not pretend you can winter here alone. A woman without fuel is a woman waiting to die." He mounted his horse and rode east without looking back. Martha stood in the doorway until his figure disappeared into the brown grass. Then she went inside and pulled the tin box from beneath the floorboards and counted the money again. $11.40. A typical Nebraska winter required 6 to 8 cords of wood or equivalent fuel. She had no wood source within 15 miles. Coal cost $8 a ton, and she would need at least 2 tons, $16 she did not have. The hay burner stove consumed a twisted cylinder every 90 minutes. She could not gather enough dried grass alone with 3 children to tend and a farm to manage. She did the math on the back of an envelope. Days until first hard freeze, approximately 60. Fuel reserves, 14 days worth. Cash needed for survival, minimum $30 to $40. Cash available, $11.40. Gap, impossible. Anna appeared at her elbow, 12 years old, thin and serious, with her father's pale eyes. "What did Mr. Hoffman want?" "He wants to help us." "Is he going to?" Martha looked at her daughter and felt the weight of the question beneath the words. "Is he going to save us? Is someone going to fix this? Are we going to survive?" "No," Martha said. "We're going to help ourselves." She had no idea how, but she knew she would die before she gave August Hoffman her land or her children, or the future Eric had built for them with his own hands. The idea came 3 weeks later, in the dark of the root cellar. September had turned cold. The nights dropped below freezing, and Martha had started burning the precious hay to keep the children warm at night. At this rate, she would be out of fuel before November. She descended into the small root cellar beneath the Sodus floor, a 6-foot square dugout where she stored potatoes and carrots from the garden. The wooden ladder creaked beneath her weight. She reached the bottom and stood in the darkness, reaching for the bin where the last of the potatoes waited. And then she noticed. It was 38 degrees outside. Frost had killed the remaining squash vines that morning. Her breath had fogged in the soddy when she woke. But down here, in the earth, the air felt almost warm. She pressed her hand against the dirt wall, not cold, not frozen. Just cool, stable. The earth had held its summer warmth even as the surface froze. Martha climbed back up and found the thermometer Eric had mounted beside the door. She carried it down into the cellar and hung it on a nail in the wall. Then she waited. 52 degrees. The surface was 38 and dropping. The cellar was 52 and holding. She remembered Dr. Cook's farm in Sodus, New York, where she had worked as a hired girl before she met Eric. Dr. Cook had a rutabaga cellar beneath his tool house, a deep room carved into the hillside where vegetables stayed unfrozen through the cruelest winters. She had asked him once how it worked, and he had laughed and said the earth was a blanket that never cooled. She remembered her father in Sweden, talking about the jordkällare, the earth cellars that had kept his family alive through winters that would kill a man in hours on the surface. 4 generations of Lindqvists had survived because they knew that the ground beneath their feet was warmer than the air above their heads. The earth holds its heat. The thought crystallized slowly, then all at once. If she could create a larger underground space, not just for vegetables, but for her family, the earth itself would provide heat. She would not need 6 cords of wood. She would not need 2 tons of coal. She would need only enough fuel to raise the temperature from 50 degrees to 60 instead of from 20 below to 60 above. Her barn sat on a slight rise. The water table was below 8 feet here, she knew, because Eric had dug a test hole when they arrived. A room beneath the barn would stay dry. The barn floor above would provide additional insulation, and the body heat of the animals rising through the planks would add warmth she did not have to buy. Martha climbed out of the root cellar and walked to the barn. She paced the floor, counting steps. The barn was 20 feet by 16 feet. If she excavated a room in the center, 12 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling height of 6 feet, she would have 72 square feet of living space. Enough for 4 people to sleep and cook and wait out the winter. She scratched the numbers in the dirt with a stick. Excavation needed approximately 576 cubic feet of earth. A strong worker could move 40 to 60 cubic feet per day. Time required 10 to 14 days of digging plus construction, total time. 6 weeks if nothing went wrong. 6 weeks. She had 8 weeks until the ground froze too hard to dig. The risk was enormous. Every hour she spent digging was an hour not spent gathering fuel for the soddy above. If the shelter failed, if it flooded, or collapsed, or proved too cold after all, she would have wasted her preparation time. She would have traded a bad situation for a worse one. She walked to Elsa Gustafsson's farm 4 miles away. Elsa was 29, widowed the previous year when her husband's horse threw him into a ravine. She had sold half her claim to survive and still lived in a soddy smaller than Martha's. She was the closest thing Martha had to a friend on the prairie. Martha explained the plan, the earth cellar, the thermal principle, the math that might save her children. Elsa listened without interrupting. When Martha finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Martha," she said finally, "I understand desperation. God knows I understand it. But you're not a builder. You're not an engineer. You're a mother of 3 who should be gathering fuel, not digging graves. It's not a grave, it's a shelter. It's a hole in the ground that you're betting your children's lives on." Elsa leaned forward. "Even if you finish it, even if it doesn't collapse and bury you alive, you'll have no fuel for the house when the digging is done. You'll have traded a bad situation for a worse one. The shelter won't need as much fuel. The earth holds the temperature at 50 degrees. I only need to warm it another 10 degrees, not 80. And if you're wrong, if the earth doesn't hold, if water seeps through or the walls cave or the temperature drops anyway?" Martha had no answer for that. She had calculations and memories and a desperate hope. She did not have certainty. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know Hoffman's math. Without this shelter, my children freeze or my children become his. I won't let either happen." Elsa studied her for a long moment. Then she went into her soddy and returned with a pick. "This was Anders's," she said. "He won't be needing it. Don't tell me what it's for. I don't want to have to lie when Hoffman asks." Martha walked home with the pick over her shoulder, the weight of it already blistering her palms through the wooden handle. She had 6 weeks. She had a spade, a borrowed pick, and 3 children who were counting on her to keep them alive. She started digging that night. The news traveled across the prairie the way news always traveled, slowly, in fragments, through the mouths of people who had no business knowing. By mid-October, half of Custer County had heard about the Swedish widow who was digging a hole beneath her barn. "She's building a cellar to live in like a badger," said the woman behind the counter at the general store in Broken Bow. "Grief has broken her." "Those poor children," said the farmer buying nails 2 aisles away. "Someone should take them before winter." The shopkeeper caught Martha's eye as she approached the counter with a sack of flour. "Mrs. Lindqvist," he said, not unkindly. "If you need help, if things have gotten difficult, there are people who can assist. The state hospital in Lincoln, for instance." Martha put her $11 on the counter. "I need flour. I need salt. I need 6 pounds of nails if you have them." "Nails?" The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose. "Building something?" "A coffin for anyone who tells me how to raise my children." The shopkeeper sold her the nails without another word, but the damage was done. The story had spread, and with it, the judgment. A woman who digs holes is a woman who has lost her reason. A woman without a husband is a woman who needs supervision. A woman with children is a woman who can have those children taken away. August Hoffman made his move in the first week of November. He rode to Martha's homestead with 2 other men, members of the loose neighborhood association that organized barn raisings and mutual aid during hard seasons. The men waited on horseback while Hoffman dismounted and walked to where Martha was hauling buckets of earth from the hole behind the barn. "Mrs. Lindqvist." His voice carried the weight of authority, of official business. "We need to talk." Martha set down her bucket. Her hands were wrapped in rags, the blisters beneath them cracked and bleeding. She had lost 15 pounds since September. Her hair was streaked with gray at the temples that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. "Talk," she said. "I've written to the territorial authorities." Hoffman pulled a paper from his coat, a copy of the letter, she realized. He wanted her to see it. "I've expressed concern about the welfare of your children. 3 young ones, a mother showing signs of mental instability, a homestead with no visible fuel supply, and a woman digging her own grave and calling it a house." Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her face still. "The children are fed. The children are warm. The children are none of your concern. The children are everyone's concern when their mother is touched in the head." Hoffman stepped closer, lowering his voice so the men behind him couldn't hear. "This can end one of 3 ways. You can sell your claim to me for a fair price and take your children somewhere safe. You can accept my proposal, and I'll see that you and the children are provided for. Or you can continue this madness, and I'll see that the children are placed with a proper family before you freeze them to death in that hole you're digging." He let the words hang in the cold air. "The choice is yours, Mrs. Lindqvist, but the prairie doesn't vote. Make your decision by first snowfall, or I'll make it for you." Martha looked past him at the 2 men on horseback. They wouldn't meet her eyes. "Get off my land." Hoffman smiled, a thin, satisfied smile. "First snowfall. That's 3 weeks at most." He mounted his horse and rode east, the other men following in silence. Martha watched them go. Then she picked up her bucket and went back to digging. She had 3 weeks. The shelter was half built, and August Hoffman had the power to take everything she had left. Week 1, late September. Martha broke ground behind the barn, cutting through the tough prairie sod that had defeated plows and broken horses across 1,000 homesteads. The first layer was the hardest, roots woven so thick she had to chop each square foot a dozen times before the spade could bite. Progress. 18 inches deep, 4 feet by 4 feet, barely a dent in what she needed. Her daily output was 40 cubic feet of earth, hauled up in buckets that weighed 30 pounds each when full. 576 cubic feet to go. She did the math in her head as she worked and tried not to think about the numbers. At night, her shoulders screamed, her palms blistered, burst, bled, and blistered again. She wrapped them in rags torn from Eric's old shirts and went back to work each morning before the children woke. Week 2. Early October. The hole reached 3 feet deep and covered the full footprint, 12 feet by 8 feet. Martha could stand in it now, though she couldn't throw the earth out anymore. She rigged a pulley system with rope and a bucket, hauling each load up and dumping it in a pile that grew higher each day. Anna started helping. She was 12, old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to keep secrets. She held the lantern when Martha dug after dark. She hauled the lighter buckets while Martha attacked the walls. "Mama," Anna said one night, her face lit orange by the lantern flame. "Mr. Hoffman came by the soddy today while you were digging." Martha's spade stopped mid-swing. "What did he want?" "He asked Johann where you were. Johann said you were tending the animals." "Good boy." Martha's grip tightened on the spade handle. "Did he look around?" "He walked toward the barn. I told him I'd scream if he came any closer." Martha pulled her daughter close, dirt and sweat and all. "You did right. You did exactly right." Week 3, mid-October. The excavation reached 5 feet. The walls rose around Martha like a grave, and she could no longer see the sky when she stood at the bottom. The earth here was different, darker, damper, shot through with clay that stuck to her spade and had to be scraped free after every stroke. Johann joined the work. 8 years old, small for his age, but fierce with the determination that had kept his father alive through 2 Atlantic crossings and 1,000 miles of prairie. He stationed himself at the top of the hole and hauled the buckets up hand over hand, his thin arms straining against the weight. "I can do it, Mama," he said when she tried to take over. "I can help." She let him help. She had no choice. On the 14th of October, the northwest corner collapsed. Martha heard it before she felt it, a wet grinding sound like the earth clearing its throat. Then the wall came down in a sheet of clay and rock that buried her to the waist and knocked the spade from her hands. For a long, terrible moment she couldn't breathe. The weight pressed against her chest. The darkness closed in. She heard Anna screaming from somewhere above, heard Johann shouting her name, and she thought, "This is how I die." In a hole, I dug myself, proving Hoffman right. Then the weight shifted. She gasped, clawed at the dirt, pulled herself free one fistful at a time. When she finally crawled out of the debris and looked up at her children's terrified faces, she started laughing. "We need timbers," she said. "Railroad ties. There's an abandoned line 6 miles east." "Mama, you almost—" "I know." Martha wiped the mud from her face with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. "But I didn't. Get me the wagon." She walked 12 miles round trip to haul each railroad tie home. The abandoned line had been started in 1885 and abandoned in 1886 when the money ran out. The ties lay scattered across the prairie like bones, free for anyone desperate enough to claim them. She made the trip 3 times before the corner was shored up properly. Week 4, late October. The excavation was complete. 12 feet by 8 feet, 6 feet deep, with vertical timbers every 3 feet and crossbeams supporting the ceiling. The walls were solid now, clay and earth packed tight against the wooden framework, stable enough to stand for years. But the shelter was far from finished. Martha needed to frame the ceiling, layer it with straw, and connect it to the barn floor above. She needed to cut a trap door and disguise it beneath a feed trough. She needed to install the stove, the small cast iron stove she had traded her last milk cow to acquire. The cow had been giving less than a quart a day anyway. The stove would keep her children alive. She worked 18 hours a day. She stopped eating breakfast to give more food to the children. She stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night because every hour sleeping was an hour not working. On the 28th of October, the first measurable snow fell. 3 inches. Enough to remind her that the deadline was real, that winter was coming whether she was ready or not. November 3rd. The ground began to freeze. Martha drove the last nail into the ceiling frame as the temperature dropped to 18 degrees. The trap door was in place, disguised beneath the feed trough. The stovepipe ran through the barn wall, disguised as a grain chute. The underground room was dark and cramped and smelled like fresh-turned earth. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever built. She descended the ladder with the thermometer in her hand. The children followed, Anna first, then Johann, then little Eric, who had spent the last 6 weeks gathering cow chips and asking questions no one would answer. Martha hung the thermometer on the wall and lit a small fire in the stove. They waited. Outside, the temperature was 18 degrees and falling. An hour later, the thermometer in the shelter read 48 degrees. Anna laughed, a sound Martha hadn't heard since Eric died. Johann pressed his palm against the earthen wall and said, "It's warm, Mama. The wall is warm." Little Eric, 5 years old and wiser than he should have been, looked at his mother with eyes that understood more than he could say. "This is where we'll live now." "When we need to," Martha said. "When the cold comes for real." But the cold hadn't come for real. Not yet. The first week of November brought temperatures in the 20s, cold but survivable. The shelter held at 45 degrees with a small fire, 42 without. The children slept underground while Martha kept watch above, hauling in the last of the twisted hay, rationing the fuel she would need to see them through. Hoffman rode past twice. He never stopped, never called out. But she saw him looking at the barn, at the lack of smoke from the soddy chimney, at the pile of earth behind the barn that she hadn't had time to spread. He was waiting. "First snowfall," he had said. "Make your decision." The snow had fallen. She had made her decision. But Hoffman wasn't finished. She could see it in the way he sat his horse, the way he watched her homestead from the fence line, like a man measuring a coffin. The shelter was built. The method was sound. The math said they would survive. But the real test hadn't come. On the evening of November 15th, Mrs. Bergstrom arrived. She was a Norwegian widow, 60 years old, who lived 8 miles distant and rarely spoke to anyone. Martha had met her exactly twice. Once at the general store, once at a funeral for a child who had drowned in the creek. She had never visited Martha's homestead. She came in a wagon pulled by a mule that looked older than God. She climbed down without a word, walked past Martha, and descended into the shelter through the trap door. Martha followed. Mrs. Bergstrom stood in the center of the underground room, turning slowly, studying the walls and the ceiling and the stovepipe with eyes that had seen things Martha couldn't imagine. "My husband built something like this in the old country," she said finally. Her voice was rough from disuse. "Before the famine, before we came here." "Does it?" Martha hesitated. "Does it look right?" Mrs. Bergstrom pointed at the trap door. "The entrance is wrong. Snow will drift against the barn wall and block it. You need to move it to the east side." "I can't. There's no time. The ground is frozen." "Then build a snow break, planks angled against the wall, directing drifts away from the door." She looked at Martha for the first time. "You have children?" "3. They'll live." Mrs. Bergstrom climbed the ladder without another word, mounted her wagon, and drove into the gathering darkness. Martha rebuilt the entrance that night, adding a wooden frame that would channel snowdrifts away from the trap door. Her hands bled through the rags. Her back screamed with every swing of the hammer. But when she finished, the shelter was complete. December came with bitter cold. Temperatures dropped to 15 below, then 20 below. The children moved underground, sleeping on pallets Martha had stuffed with dried grass, waking to warmth that seemed miraculous after the months of shivering in the soddy above. The shelter worked. Every night, the thermometer held between 40 and 50 degrees. The stove consumed a quarter of the fuel it would have needed in the sod house. The earth embraced them, protected them, held them safe while the wind screamed across the surface and the snow piled higher against the barn. Hoffman noticed. He mentioned it at the general store in Broken Bow, and the words made their way back to Martha through Elsa Gustafson. "He said you've given up," Elsa reported. "He said you're probably burning furniture, that you'll come begging by New Year's." "Let him think what he wants." "Martha," Elsa's voice dropped. "People are asking questions. Your children look healthy. Too healthy for a woman with no fuel and no husband. They're wondering how." Let them wonder. But Martha wondered too. The shelter worked for December's cold, 20 below, 25 below. But what about January? What about 40 below? What about the storms that buried houses and froze cattle standing upright and killed men within yards of their own doors? She had gambled everything on an idea. The idea had worked so far. But winter wasn't finished yet. January arrived like a held breath. The first 11 days brought the worst cold Martha had ever experienced, temperatures plunging to 30 below, winds that cut through clothing like knives, snow that fell sideways and seemed determined to bury everything that breathed. The shelter held. 38 degrees at the worst of it, 42 with the fire burning. The children complained of boredom, of the darkness, of the closeness of the earthen walls. Martha told them stories about Sweden, about the Jordkellar, where their grandfather had sheltered through winters that made Nebraska seem gentle. On the morning of January 11th, something changed. Martha climbed out of the shelter to check the animals and felt the air on her face. Warm, impossibly warm for January. The thermometer outside the barn read 28 degrees, 50 degrees warmer than the night before. The snow began to melt. Water dripped from the barn eaves. Children emerged from houses across the county, blinking in the sudden warmth, running without coats for the first time in weeks. Martha should have felt relief. She felt dread instead. She remembered her father's voice, teaching her to read the weather in Sweden. When the cold breaks too fast, something is coming behind it. The sky is lying to you. The pressure is falling when it should be rising. That means a storm, a big one, building behind the warmth. She found her barometer, the one Eric had brought from the old country. The needle was dropping fast. That evening, she moved the family underground. Johann protested. "Mama, it's warm. We can sleep in the soddy tonight." "No, but I don't trust this warmth," Martha said. She looked at the sky, clear, mild, peaceful. "The sky is lying to us. We sleep below." She didn't know what was coming. She knew only that the earth had never lied to her, and the sky had never felt so false. The children climbed down the ladder. Martha followed, pulling the trapdoor closed behind her. Above them, the warmth lingered. The stars came out. The neighbors relaxed. And 300 miles to the northwest, the storm was already building, a mass of Arctic air so cold and so fast that it would cross the prairie like a freight train, dropping temperatures 60 degrees in minutes, driving snow so fine it would fill lungs and freeze skin and kill more than 200 people before it was done. The schoolhouse blizzard was coming, and Martha Lindqvist was the only one underground. January 12th, 1888. The morning dawned bright and impossibly warm. 44 degrees by 10 o'clock. The sky stretched blue and endless in every direction, not a cloud visible from horizon to horizon. Across Nebraska, settlers emerged from their houses like animals after hibernation. Children walked to school without coats, laughing at the miracle of warmth in the dead of winter. Farmers checked livestock that had huddled for weeks, finally able to work without fingers going numb. Wives hung laundry on lines that had been frozen solid since December. Martha stayed underground. The children asked to go outside. Johann pressed his case with the persistence of an 8-year-old who had been trapped in a dirt room for 2 months. "Mama, please. It's warm. I can hear the water dripping from the barn roof, just for an hour." "No." "But everyone else didn't watch their father die." Martha's voice came out harder than she intended. She softened it. "I'm sorry, but we stay down. Just for today. If I'm wrong, we'll go out tomorrow." Anna understood without being told. She had seen her mother reading the barometer, had watched her face change when the needle dropped. She gathered her brothers to the far corner of the shelter and started a game with buttons and string, keeping them occupied while Martha climbed the ladder to check the sky. At noon, the temperature outside read 46 degrees. The warmest January day in memory. Martha could hear voices in the distance. The Hoffman children, probably, released from their house to enjoy the thaw. She checked the barometer again. Still falling faster now. At 2 o'clock, she fed the horse, still alive, though thin, and the remaining chickens. She hauled water from the well, breaking through a thin crust of ice that had formed overnight and melted by morning. The air smelled like spring, like mud, and wet grass, and hope. She didn't trust it. At 3 o'clock, she descended into the shelter and pulled the trapdoor closed behind her. "We're staying down tonight," she told the children. "No arguments." Little Eric started to cry. He wanted to see the sun. He wanted to feel warm air on his face. He was 5 years old and had spent most of the winter in a hole in the ground, and he didn't understand why his mother wouldn't let him climb out when the world had finally turned kind. Martha held him while he sobbed. She didn't have words to explain what she felt: the wrongness of the warmth, the silence of the barometer's warning, the memory of her father saying the sky is lying to you. At 3:15, the world ended. It came from the northwest, a wall of black that stretched from the ground to the heavens, moving faster than anything Martha had ever seen. Later, survivors would say it crossed the prairie at 45 miles per hour. Later, meteorologists would call it the most sudden temperature drop in recorded history. Later, historians would count the dead and call it the schoolhouse blizzard, the children's blizzard, the day the plains turned white with death. In the moment, there was only the sound. Martha heard it first, a roar like a locomotive, like a waterfall, like nothing she had words for. The barn shook. The horse screamed once, a sound of pure animal terror, and then the scream cut off as if a hand had closed around its throat. The temperature fell 40 degrees in 3 minutes. The children huddled together on the sleeping pallets, their faces pale in the lantern light. Anna had her arms around both brothers, holding them still, keeping them from crying out. She looked at her mother with eyes that asked, "Did you know? Did you know this was coming?" Martha didn't answer. She was listening. The wind hit the barn like a fist. She heard timbers crack, heard the shriek of nails pulling free, heard the entire structure groan against forces it was never built to withstand. Snow began to sift through the floorboards above them, fine as flour, driven by winds that found every gap and crack and weakness. The trapdoor rattled. The wooden frame Martha had built to channel snowdrifts away from the entrance held, but she could hear the snow piling against it, could feel the weight beginning to press down. "Keep the fire burning," she told Anna. "Small, steady, don't let it go out." Martha climbed the ladder. She had to see. She had to know what they were facing. She pushed against the trapdoor and felt resistance, snow already packed against the wood, though the blizzard had been blowing for only minutes. She shoved harder, got the door open 6 inches, and looked out into hell. There was no visibility. None. She could not see her own hand when she extended it into the wind. The snow wasn't falling, it was flying sideways, horizontal, a white wall of ice crystals so fine they didn't feel like snow at all. They felt like sand, like needles, like 1,000 tiny knives driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds. The cold hit her face and she gasped. Her skin went numb instantly. The moisture in her eyes began to freeze. She could feel ice forming on her eyelashes, welding them together, and she understood in that moment how men could die within feet of their own doors. She pulled back into the shelter and slammed the trapdoor closed. "We don't open that again," she said. "Not until morning, not for any reason." The storm raged. By 6 o'clock, the temperature outside had fallen to 11 degrees below zero. By 9 o'clock, it was 22 below. By midnight, the thermometer would read 42 degrees below zero, colder than any night in the memory of living Nebraskans. Inside the shelter, the temperature held at 38 degrees. The children slept in shifts. Martha fed the fire every 3 hours, a small fire, just enough to keep the chill at bay, burning twisted hay that she rationed with the precision of a miser counting coins. She had enough fuel for 2 weeks at this rate. She had expected to need it for occasional cold snaps, not for survival against the worst storm in the state's history. At 7 o'clock, a new sound joined the howling wind. A crack, deep and structural, from somewhere above. The barn was breaking. Johann sat up on his pallet. "Mama? It's the barn. The wind is pushing against it. Will it fall on us?" Martha looked at the ceiling, the cottonwood beams she had salvaged, the packed straw, the layer of earth she had added for insulation. If the barn collapsed, the weight would come down on the shelter. The beams might hold. They might not. I need to check. Mama, no. She was already climbing the ladder. She pushed the trapdoor open against packed snow, a foot deep now, despite the windbreak. The cold was a physical assault, a violence against every inch of exposed skin. She crawled 3 feet to the barn wall and pressed her palm against the wood. The barn was listing. She could feel it, a tilt to the southwest, where the wind was hitting hardest. The joints were pulling apart. If the wind didn't let up, the whole structure would come down by morning. She crawled to where the horse had been standing. It was still standing. Its legs were locked beneath it, frozen in place. Its eyes were open, glazed with ice. Frost had formed on its muzzle, in its nostrils, around the edges of its lips where breath had turned to ice. The horse had frozen to death standing up. It hadn't even had time to lie down. Martha touched its flank, solid as stone, colder than the air. She had been outside for 90 seconds. Her fingers were white. Her cheeks had no feeling. The skin around her eyes was burning with the cold that would become frostbite if she stayed another minute. She crawled back to the trap door and dropped into the shelter, pulling the door closed behind her. "The barn will hold," she said. She didn't know if it was true. "We stay down." 3/4 of a mile east, August Hoffman was fighting to save his family. His sod house was well built, 2-foot walls, a lumber roof reinforced with extra beams after the snow winter of 80 to 81. He had 23 cords of wood stacked against the north wall. He had coal in the cellar and food in the pantry, and enough supplies to last until spring. But his son Wilhelm was at school. The schoolhouse was 4 miles away. When the storm hit at 3:15, Wilhelm and 2 other boys decided to run for home. They were farm boys, strong and fast, and they knew the land between the schoolhouse and their homes the way they knew their own hands. They made it half a mile before the visibility dropped to 0. At 6 o'clock, August Hoffman tied a rope to his door handle. He played out 40 feet of rope and walked into the darkness, feeling for the fence line, calling his son's name into a wind that swallowed sound like water swallowing stones. He found nothing. At the end of the rope, he could not see the light from his own window. He could not hear his wife calling from the doorway. He stood in the absolute white darkness and understood that one more step would mean his death, that he would wander until his legs gave out and his heart stopped and the snow buried him where he fell. He followed the rope back. He would spend the night burning his carefully stacked wood, feeding the stove every 20 minutes, keeping his wife and remaining children alive, while the wind screamed and the snow piled higher, and his son's body lay somewhere in the darkness, reaching for a fence post he would never find. 2 miles north, the Miller family was burning their furniture. Their frame house was newer than most, built with lumber shipped from Omaha and windows with real glass. But frame houses had gaps. Frame houses let the wind in, and when the blizzard hit, the wind found a crack in the window frame and drove snow into the main room with such force that the family retreated to the back bedroom. There was no stove in the back bedroom. Henry Miller broke apart a chair first, then a table, then the bed frame itself. He burned the wood in a small pile on the dirt floor, smoke filling the room, children coughing, his wife holding the 2 youngest against her body to share what warmth remained. By midnight, they had burned everything that would burn. By 2 in the morning, the fire was out. By dawn, 2 of the Miller children, ages 4 and 6, had frozen to death in their mother's arms. Martha did not sleep. She sat by the stove, feeding it twisted hay in small handfuls, watching the thermometer on the wall. 38 degrees, 37, 38 again. The temperature fluctuated within a narrow band, never falling below 35, never rising above 42. The earth was holding. Above her, the storm raged for 18 hours. She heard the barn creak and groan. She heard the wind find new gaps, new weaknesses, new ways to howl through the structure she and Eric had built 3 years ago. She heard what sounded like boards tearing free and spinning away into the darkness. But the shelter held. At 4 in the morning, Johann woke with a nightmare. He had dreamed the walls were closing in, that the earth was swallowing them, that they would be buried alive like his father's body in the churchyard back in Sweden. Martha held him while he shook. She didn't tell him it was just a dream. She didn't tell him everything would be fine. She told him the truth. The earth is keeping us alive. The earth is holding back the cold while everyone else freezes. The same dirt you're afraid of is the only thing standing between us and death. Johann was silent for a long moment. Then, the earth is like Papa. It's taking care of us. Martha's throat closed around a grief she didn't have time for. Yes, she managed. It's like Papa. At 6 in the morning, little Eric woke crying for water. Martha melted snow from the small drift that had accumulated in the corner where the trapdoor didn't quite seal. She gave him the water warm, heated over the stove, and watched him drink. Fuel consumed during the night. Approximately 8 pounds of twisted hay. If she had been in the sod house, she would have burned 10 times that much and still lost the battle against the cold. At 7:30, the wind began to die. Martha waited until full daylight before she opened the trapdoor. The world outside was white and silent. The wind had stopped. The sky had cleared to a blue so deep and pure it hurt to look at. The thermometer outside the barn, miraculously still attached to the wall, read 39 degrees below zero. She climbed out of the shelter and stood in the barn. The horse was a statue of ice. 4 of 6 chickens lay frozen in the corner where they had huddled for warmth. The barn itself had survived, though the southwest wall was visibly bowed and several boards had torn free from the roof. The sod house had not fared as well. The roof had partially collapsed under the weight of drifted snow. If they had been inside, they would have been buried. Martha walked to the barn door and pushed it open. The prairie stretched white and still in every direction. No movement, no sound, no smoke from neighboring chimneys. She walked toward the Hoffman fence line, her boots breaking through a crust of snow that crackled like broken glass. 50 yards from her barn, she found him. Wilhelm Hoffman lay curled against a fence post, his hands frozen to the wood. He had died reaching. He had died trying. He had made it to within a quarter-mile of home, close enough that on any other night he could have seen the light in his own window. The blizzard hadn't given him any other night. The blizzard had given him only darkness and cold, and a fence post that became his grave marker. Martha stood over the boy's body for a long time. She had argued with his father. She had resented his father. She had feared his father's power to take her children and her land. But Wilhelm was just a boy, 14 years old, dead because he had tried to walk home from school. She returned to the barn and helped her children climb out of the shelter. Anna first, then Johann, then little Eric. They stood blinking in the brilliant sunlight, their faces flushed with warmth that seemed impossible given what surrounded them. "Is it over?" Anna asked. "The storm is over." Martha looked toward the Hoffman homestead, toward the Miller place, toward all the scattered homesteads where families had huddled and prayed and burned their furniture and watched their children die. But the counting hasn't started yet. The counting would take weeks. In the end, the schoolhouse blizzard of January 12, 1888 killed over 200 people across the Great Plains. More than 100 of them were Nebraskans. The majority were children, caught walking home from school, frozen within sight of their own doors, buried in snowdrifts that wouldn't melt until March. On Lillian Creek and its tributaries, 7 families had lived in sod houses. 3 people from those families died. Wilhelm Hoffman and 2 others who had ventured out looking for livestock. 2 families had lived in frame houses. 5 people from those families died, the Miller children, and 3 adults who had run out of fuel. 1 family had lived in an underground shelter beneath a barn. No one from that family died. 3 days after the storm, August Hoffman rode to Martha's homestead. He was wearing black. His face had the hollow look of a man who hadn't slept since his world ended. He dismounted slowly, like a man carrying a weight he couldn't set down, and stood in the trampled snow outside Martha's barn. He didn't speak for a long time. Martha waited. "I came to bury you," he said finally. His voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "I had already spoken to the pastor about arrangements. I told him there would be 4 coffins needed, 1 adult, 3 children. I'm sorry about Wilhelm." Hoffman's jaw tightened. I know where he is now. Found him yesterday, holding onto my fence post, quarter-mile from home. He looked at the barn, at the mound of earth behind it that Martha hadn't had time to spread, at the children watching from the doorway. I was wrong. Martha said nothing. How did you survive? She led him to the trap door. She showed him the ladder, the underground room, the stove barely cool from the night's fire, the sleeping pallets where her children had waited out the worst storm in Nebraska history. Hoffman stood in the shelter for a long time. He pressed his palm against the earthen wall. He read the thermometer, still showing 44 degrees. He looked at the ceiling, at the timbers, at the simple design that had saved 4 lives while his son froze within sight of home. My boy died a quarter-mile away, he said. His voice broke on the word boy. If I had dug a hole like this, if I had listened to what the earth could teach instead of what I already thought I knew. He climbed the ladder without another word. He mounted his horse and rode east toward his homestead, toward the empty place at his table, toward the grave he would dig when the ground thawed enough to accept a body. He never apologized for his threats. He never mentioned the letter to the territorial authorities or the plans to take her children or the proposals that had felt more like ultimatums than offers, but he asked her permission to copy the design. Martha gave it freely. Within a week, 9 families had visited Martha's homestead. They came from homesteads scattered across 20 miles of prairie, families who had heard the stories, who had counted their own dead, who wanted to understand how 1 widow and 3 children had survived when strong men with full woodpiles had not. They brought what little they could spare, a sack of flour, a precious tin of coffee, a blanket that had probably belonged to someone who didn't need it anymore. They stood in Martha's underground room and asked questions with the desperate hunger of people who never wanted to be unprepared again. How deep must it be? 4 feet minimum. 6 is better. Below the frost line, the temperature stays stable. What about water seepage? Build on high ground if you can. Slope the floor toward one corner. Dig a small sump to catch any water that comes through. How do you vent the stove without losing heat? The pipe runs horizontal for 8 feet before it turns up through the wall. The heat transfers to the earth along the way. By the time the air reaches the outside, it's already given most of its warmth to the soil. Can you show us the framing? Martha drew diagrams in the snow. She measured timbers with her hands. She invited skeptical farmers underground to feel the temperature themselves, 45 degrees on a day when the surface read 12 below. Elsa Gustafson came on the 4th day. She stood at the edge of Martha's property for a long time before approaching, as if she was afraid of what she might say. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick. I told you not to dig this. I told you it would kill you. I remember. I was wrong. Elsa's eyes were wet. I was so sure I was right. I was so sure you were going to die. You were trying to protect me. I was trying to protect myself from feeling guilty when you froze. Elsa wiped her face with the back of her hand. Can you show me how to build one? Martha showed her. By spring, 4 families on Lillian Creek had begun excavating underground shelters. By the winter of 1888 to 89, at least 12 families across Custer County had built their own versions of Martha's design. Mrs. Bergstrom, the Norwegian widow who had arrived uninvited and told Martha her entrance was wrong, became an informal consultant. She visited homesteads across the region, studying each shelter, suggesting improvements, sharing knowledge she had carried from the old country. We called them jordkjellere, she told Martha during one visit. Your people had them too, the jordkeller. The old ways knew what the new ways forgot. We just had to remember. Martha shared everything she knew. She refused all offers of payment. When a farmer from Broken Bow offered her $10 for the plans, she laughed. My husband died because I could not save him from the typhoid, she said. I built this shelter because I would not lose his children the same way. If I keep the secret and another child freezes in January, I am no better than the fever. The farmer put his money away and borrowed her pick instead. Martha Lindqvist proved her homestead claim in 1890. Receiving full title to 160 acres of land that had cost her a husband, 6 weeks of digging, and the contempt of neighbors who thought she had lost her mind. She never remarried. In 1892, she purchased an additional 80 acres from August Hoffman, the parcel that bordered the creek, the one he had tried to buy from her, the one he had threatened to take through marriage or madness. He sold it at a fair price, and neither of them mentioned the winter of '88 during the transaction. She raised all three children to adulthood on that land. Anna became a school teacher in Broken Bow, spending 30 years teaching children in the same schoolhouse where other children had set out into the blizzard and never arrived. Johann inherited the homestead and farmed it until 1945, when his son took over. Little Eric became a carpenter, building houses across Custer County. Every house Eric built had a basement. Martha died in 1923 at age 70. Her obituary in the Custer County Chief noted that she had been one of the first women to prove a homestead claim alone in the county, that she had raised 3 children without a husband, and that she had survived the Great Blizzard of 1888. It did not mention how. The underground shelter design Martha adapted from traditional Scandinavian practice spread across the Great Plains in the decades following the schoolhouse blizzard. Root cellars grew larger. Basements became standard. The distinction between food storage and human shelter blurred as homesteaders remembered what the old country had taught and the new country had made them forget. By 1900, the Nebraska State Board of Agriculture was recommending earth-sheltered spaces for rural homesteads, not just for vegetables, but for the safety of the family in cases of extreme weather. The principle Martha had rediscovered by observation in a 6-foot square root cellar was now official policy. The earth maintains a stable temperature regardless of surface conditions. At a depth of 4 to 10 feet, ground temperature remains between 50 and 55 degrees year-round, warm enough to survive a blizzard, cool enough to store food through summer. The technical term is thermal mass effect. Martha would have called it common sense if anyone had thought to ask her. Modern earth-sheltered homes operate on the same principle. They cost less to heat. They cost less to cool. They survive storms that destroy conventional buildings. The architects who design them cite passive solar principles and sustainable construction methods. They rarely cite a Swedish widow who dug a hole beneath her barn because she had no other choice. As Nebraska became more settled, as coal became cheaper and railroads more reliable, the urgency of earth-sheltered survival faded. Basements became storage spaces, then recreation rooms, then places to forget about. The knowledge that had saved Martha's children became a curiosity, then a footnote, then nothing at all. But the schoolhouse blizzard never entirely faded from memory. In 1940, survivors formed the 1888 Blizzard Club. They met annually into the 1980s, sharing photographs and stories while their numbers dwindled year by year. A teacher named Minnie Freeman, who had led her students to safety through the storm, became a legend, her face painted in a mural at the Nebraska State Capitol in 1967, her story taught in schools across the state. No mural was ever painted of Martha Lindqvist. No story was ever taught about the widow who dug. But every winter, when the forecast turns dark and the temperature begins to drop, some families in Nebraska still check their basements. They stock water and blankets and battery-powered lights. They remember, even if they don't know why, that the safest place in a blizzard is underground. The earth remembers, even when people forget. Near the site of Martha's original homestead, in a field that Johann's grandchildren still farm, there is a depression in the earth. The barn collapsed in 1912. The sod house had dissolved back into the prairie decades before that. The fence posts rotted and were replaced and rotted again. The creek changed course twice during floods that washed away every other landmark Martha would have recognized. But if you know where to look, if you walk the fence line until you reach the slight rise where the water table drops below 8 feet, you can find the place where she dug. The hole has filled in over 100 years. The timbers rotted. The earthen walls slumped and settled. What remains is a shallow depression, perhaps 2 feet lower than the surrounding field, covered with the same prairie grass that Martha cut for fuel during the desperate autumn of 1887. Johann's grandchildren don't know what made the depression. They plant around it because the soil there drains poorly, because the ground seems softer, because something about that patch of earth feels different from the rest. The earth still remembers. The schoolhouse blizzard of January. 1888 killed more than 200 people across the Great Plains. It orphaned children, bankrupted families, and broke the spirits of settlers who thought they understood the prairie. But it also proved something that Martha Lindqvist had bet her children's lives on. The earth does not abandon those who trust it. The surface world may rage and freeze and kill. The wind may drive snow like sand through every crack and gap. The temperature may fall 60 degrees in an hour, faster than any human can adapt. The sky may lie, promising warmth while death builds on the horizon. But beneath the ground, where the temperature never changes, where the wind cannot reach, where the cold cannot penetrate, there is a refuge that has existed since before humans walked the plains. The Scandinavians knew it. The Norwegians knew it. Martha's father knew it, and his father before him, back through generations who survived Nordic winters that made Nebraska seem gentle. Martha Lindqvist did not invent this knowledge. She remembered it from her father, from old country ways, from the intuition that the land was speaking to her if she would only listen. She remembered it because she had no choice. She remembered it because her children would die if she forgot. She remembered it because sometimes the only way forward is down into the dark, into the earth, into the place where everyone says you're digging your own grave. Her neighbors called her mad. The blizzard called her mother. And the earth called her wise.